Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Christopher Hitchens, a man of letters. He writes a regular column for Vanity Fair and for The Nation. He's the author of numerous books, most recently Letters to a Young Contrarian and Unacknowledged Legislation, Writers in the Public Sphere. He is the 2002 Sanford Elberg Lecturer at the University of California at Berkeley. Christopher, welcome. Back, I should say.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and nice to be back.
Where were you educated?
Well, first at a series of boarding schools for boys, prep schools. I was sent off when I was about 7 to boarding school because family kept moving around. The first place I remember, actually, is Malta, when the British Navy still had a big base in Valletta. Powerfully influenced me, I think. My first memory is the Grand Harbour at Valletta, because I've always spent a lot of time in the Mediterranean and the Middle East and always felt kind of happy there. And maybe it's because of this first memory. But anyway, we kept shifting. So boarding school was the solution in those days. I was the first member of my family to go to a private school. One of these was a school basically for the children of officers and Navy and Army people on Dartmoor, Devonshire. And then I went to school, another boarding school, a Methodist-run boarding school in Cambridge, between the ages of 13 and 17. And then I got from there to Oxford University to read philosophy.
And
in England, this is called a conventional education, I think for the reason that it applies to only about 1.5% of the population.
You've called yourself a rooted cosmopolitan. And you speak of a potentially democratic and cosmopolitan patriotism. This in a way harkens back to this background you just described.
Yes, I can't believe, especially as you put it like that it does not in some way, because if you're partly English, well, I suppose in a way I'm wholly English. I mean, one of the things about that is you don't have much of an identity crisis. Okay? I don't know why it is, but we don't. In fact, the subject is the term is thought rather laughable in English life. But if you have an admixture of refugee, rootless cosmopolitans in your life and in your family background, and if your main impulse, as mine was, I discovered quite young, to move to the United States, somehow I always knew I wanted to do that. Felt like I'd been born in the wrong country, even though I love it and feel at home there. Yeah, this is having both roots and cosmopolitanism. I think, by the way, everyone should be so lucky. That's how I hope globalization plays out, that everyone knows where they come from and are secure in that knowledge, but nobody has to stay put if they don't want to.
Can you tell us about any politically formative experiences early in your life that really, whether before you went to college or after you were at the university, that really pointed you on the trajectory that your politics took?
Well, the background noise to my childhood, my boyhood, was the collapsing scenery of the British Empire, the last stages of it, and the subsequent defeat in 1964, when I would have been, I suppose, 15, born in 49, of the long reign of the post-war, Conservative Party. And the way I approached that was as follows. My parents had been, especially my father, politically very conservative, but as far as I could see, they got nothing out of being conservative. It seemed rather as if they were being taken for a bit of a ride by the monarchy, the empire, the Tory party, and so on, the class system. I couldn't see where they got their share of it. So I had a sort of rather pitying attitude to their politics, I suppose. And I think that, therefore, must have influenced me in looking, as soon as I was old enough to make any inquiries, to the left for company and for solutions. And on the whole, finding them. I mean, particularly reading the novels of George Orwell about the lower middle class, I remember impressing me very much. Well, this guy knows what it feels like in my family, and he sees the contradiction. But so there wasn't a formative moment or a Damascus moment, I don't think, though I can remember deciding, after reading a book by Arthur Koestler when I was quite young, about capital punishment, that I was very much opposed to the death penalty. And making that's my first conscious political decision. And I didn't realize, but that was also going to put me in very much at odds with the milieu in which I'd been brought up.
Now, you, in your new book, you call yourself a contrarian, and
well, my publisher does.
Your publisher does, okay. But in identifying or accepting that label, you seem to be saying you're born to it. It's in you to be that way. Is that true? I mean, do you feel that about yourself?
Well, if you'll forgive just a moment of vanity, part of that book of mine, Letters to a Young Contrarian, consists of an argument with my publisher about why I still think the title sucks.
I see.
Because I think the word contrarian has something cringe-making about it.
I see.
It's a bit like being a licensed jester or a permitted awkward customer or bad boy or loose cannon. Although we have an interesting wealth, very interesting to me, the profusion of condescending terms we do have for dissent. But as I also point out, if you say you're a dissenter or a dissident, you're claiming a term of honor that you can't just claim, you have to earn. Mm-hmm. However, yes, the oppositional character, I'm certain, is innate in some people. I'm not sure if it's innate originally in all people and only manifest in some. I couldn't say, but I do know for certain that it was innate in me, and that this I seem to have found going through life that I naturally meet other people who feel the same. It's very difficult to explain, but you recognize the symptoms of a fellow sufferer when you encounter one.
Mm-hmm. I know you don't like to be put in a political generation.
No, I don't mind.
But so let me ask you, how do you think you were affected by the 60s?
Well, no, I do. I mean, I think I've no choice but to put myself in a political generation. Mm-hmm. And but I'm glad you say the 60s, because I think I've always thought that I wish I could find out the name of the person who said that of all the kinds of human solidarity, the generational is the lowest. Because what do you have to do except have an accident of birth? Mm-hmm. I mean, to be a 60s person, all you have to do is be born in a certain year. It's like wine, except not as good. To be a 68er, however, a 68er, we even have a French term for it now, mm-hmm. You have to have been someone who, in some sense, felt or saw the 68 crisis coming and was in some sense ready for it, or, if not that, was totally swept up in it, realized that here was a crux moment, a hinge year. Mm-hmm. And I'm lucky in that I made my decision that I thought it was going to be key in 67, I mean, the year I went to Oxford, actually, and joined a small Trotskyist, Luxemburgist organization, which in the next year quadrupled, no, much more than quadrupled its membership. In the other sense of the 60s, I was rather cold towards things like drug taking, which I think is a pathetic pursuit, to the mistaking of work for play, mm-hmm. To the cult of youth, to all that sort of rather bogus utopianism. I never felt very strongly about that. I just did think it was a year to be compared with 1848 as a European and international revolution.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think were the consequences of that period?
I don't mean to say, by the way, by that I was against sex or rock and roll.
Right.
There was a certain amount of that.
Yeah.
But a lot of what people now remember, and what is now sold and marketed as the 60s, mm-hmm. So, I mean, my hair remained much the same length. Mm-hmm. I certainly didn't wear any beads. As I told you, I have contempt for narcotics. That kind of stuff, and for gurus. Mm-hmm. So, you know, and I'm very, actually, one of the things that I spend a fair amount of time doing is defending a certain interpretation of the 60s, especially the 68er, from the cheap and illusory and often bogus mm-hmm. stuff that is described as having been the 60s.
And so what's lasting?
That led me to a confrontation in my life, which, if you don't mind,
yeah, no, please.
might help us focus on another question, which I'm hoping you're going to ask me, which is the most famous person of my class at Oxford, or my generation, if you mm-hmm. prefer, was William Jefferson Clinton. Mm-hmm. So when people started to say, both for him and against him, well, at least he, or he sure does express the spirit of the 60s, I thought, no, not while I'm around. He's not going to get mm-hmm. away with being the exemplary 60s person. Mm-hmm. That's a big difference. That's one of many quarrels between him and me.
And it was because his, in whatever respect he identified with the right things of the 60s, he later renounced that identification.
And when he was doing that, he was going along to get along as well, or going along to get along. And yes, sure, I mean, I actually know why he can claim not to have inhaled, mm-hmm. because I remember it only too well. He He's allergic to smoke, as it happens, but he's not allergic to brownies,
I see.
into which large numbers of leaves can be mashed and mainlined.
That's right.
It was a rather clever response of his, but shows the essential cheapness and dishonesty of the guy. And he was, I would say, a draft dodger rather than an anti-war person. And in other words, he's the cheap and nasty version of something that actually was, in many ways, culturally well worth having.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think what had an enduring effect from that period in terms of our outlook on the world, the 60s?
Well, I think myself that it exposed the hollowness of the Cold War in two ways. One, it said that there may or may not be a struggle with authoritarian communism, but you can't, in the name of that, justify something like the devastation by chemical pollutants and napalm and phosphorus of the people and landscape of Vietnam, nor can you justify having in Europe governments like that of General de Gaulle, General Franco, General Salazar, and General Papadopoulos, who were four European governments of the NATO alliance. And that, we got rid of all them, or the '68 generation got rid of all that lot, and we at least contributed to stopping an unjust, aggressive war. But the people who I got to know in Cuba and Czechoslovakia and Poland, also in that era, probably vindicated the promise in what may now have been an even more important way, and it was that the last seismic echoes of that are, I think, what took place in 1989. Mm-hmm. It's indirect and in some ways unintentional, but many of the same people who I'd met then became part of the leadership of that great movement of emancipation. And also, you could tell from the style of the people in the streets of Berlin and Prague and Poland that year, blue jeans, rock and roll, posters of John Lennon and so forth, that yes, that they'd noticed that there was something liberating about this too. So in a way, the best vindication didn't come to me till I was, 39, 40. But it was well worth waiting for.
And as a man who studies history, that you were ready to wait, that it took longer than it should have.
Well, Hegel says somewhere that the owl of Minerva doesn't take wing until dusk. The owls don't fly till it starts to get dark. In other words, it's an overused image in some ways, but it's always been attractive to me because it is only at the close of an epoch that you can really say that it was an epoch at all. You can give it some kind of measure and depth. And yes, I don't think the owls of '68 became Minerva-like until '89. And even Timothy Garton-Ash, who took the same view in a funny way from a more conservative position than I did, diagnosed it roughly the same way, managed to do it in a hieroglyphic. And I don't believe in numerology, but if you write the letters 19, if you write the letters 68 and 89, and then turn them upside down, they are the same.
So when did you decide to become a writer?
I don't think it was, this may sound, I hope it doesn't sound solipsistic, but it was sort of decided for me, I think. And I believe it's true of anyone who makes it their life. It isn't what you do, it's what you are. In other words, that somehow you've always known. Anyways, I certainly felt that I'd always known, not just that it was all that I wanted to do, or felt I had to do, but probably all that I could do. I still can't imagine what it would be like doing something else. I mean, I'm sure I could be, say, a lawyer of some kind, but I just don't know what it would, I have no idea what it would be like. And if I was doing it, I feel like a sort of a conehead, wondering if all the people around me were noticing that he's almost behaving like one of us, but he's not really one. How do they do it? I have no idea. I only know one thing.
Now you have a view of almost a political philosophy, of personal philosophy, and I'm just curious as to how that relates, or is it totally intertwined with your sense of yourself as a writer? You say, I think if the position of the independent mind or writer means anything at all, it means acceptance of individual responsibility. So talk a little about that in other words, the trajectory of your personal evolution is intimately tied with the way you write and what you write.
Sure, and I certainly, the form it took with me when I was much younger was that I hoped to become a voice for a movement, that I would be one of its champions in print. For a while, from between 67 and about 74 or 5, I was a member of a Marxist organization, as I told you, a rather odd post-Trotskyist, Rosa Luxemburgist group, which I'm not sorry I was involved with. I learned a lot from it. But I probably stayed too long in, and one of the things that taught me was that you mustn't become, or try and become, a party liner, however good the party may be. As a writer, that's a betrayal. And I wrote some good polemics and pamphleteering in that period, but I wouldn't want to reread any of it anymore, and nor, I think, would anyone else. So it's been partly an emancipation of myself from politics, has been involved here, and I suppose also more confidence that people would actually care to read something by me that wasn't just an argument, that was a discussion or a review, or not about public affairs at all.
You wrote somewhere, and I can't recall where this was, you said, I don't think liberals make very good writers. I think liberals are always trying to have it both ways. I think it may have been in the Berlin Review, maybe, or maybe not.
No, I'm sure actually that's from the letters.
The letters, okay.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, that's part of my critique of Isaiah Berlin, who's often praised as a great stylist as well as a great thinker. Actually, here is a guy who is not willing to be brave and not willing to make enemies, but who wants a reputation both for being even-handed and objective and fair-minded. By the way, those three things do not and never have meant the same, though they're often used interchangeably. That's what I meant. It's what I put rather, I think, a bit too casually in this excerpt you mentioned.
So how do you write? Do you does it come? The words flow easily? Do you get your best ideas in a crowd, or do you like the solitude and the drink and the quiet?
I like all of the above. I need all of the above, and I hope it doesn't sound glib to say, but I don't find the production of words very difficult, either when I'm talking or writing. And indeed, the only thing I find difficult is not doing it, is keeping quiet or not writing. I'm not really happy when I'm not doing it. So I'm very lucky, aren't I, to be doing the only thing I'm able to do, or something that isn't really even an ability. I mean, it's more like a knack. I didn't have to qualify for it. So that's luck, if you like. What more can I say?
So how
much more.
How do you envision your audience as you write? Do you think about that person out there? I mentioned that you write for both The Nation and Vanity Fair. At one level, that sounds like two very different audiences. Maybe not.
No, with The Nation, I have a very good idea of the sort of people who are reading me, and indeed have met. I've been doing the column for 20 years. I've probably met quite a lot of them, quite a fair proportion of them.
Not that many readers.
And I know exactly what a Nation reader is like. And writing a column of about 1,000 words every other week, which is what I've been doing for 2 decades, is no more really demanding than writing a letter to an intelligent and humorous friend would be of 1,000 words or so. If you can do that, you can be a columnist, and you can spare chunks of explanation, because you know the person knows the point you're trying to make. With Vanity Fair, the readership is so enormous that it's very important that I don't try and think who the audience is. That again, I try and write for everyone to read, as if I was addressing an intelligent and humorous friend. Though this time I wouldn't have to stipulate, as I would with The Nation, that person is probably quite political and fairly firmly to the left. You don't have to make that stipulation. All you need to do is to talk to everybody as you would talk to your smartest or wittiest pal. And the great discovery you make is that that's how people quite like to be talked to. If they suspect for a moment that you're thinking, well, wait a minute, there are lots of trailer park readers of Vanity Fair, I'd better put in something for them, they'll sniff you out in a second, as they should. They'll know right away if you are being in the least bit condescending. And so that's how I write. Now, the rest of the time, I write to please myself, actually. I don't care if anyone else likes it or not. I think if I like it, who knows? I'll try it on the others. But I'm not trying to write to win them over, please them, or sell them anything.
You quote Orwell as saying the prime responsibility lays in being able to tell people what they did not wish to hear.
Yes, that was Orwell's. Orwell made 2 or 3 rather cryptic but very memorable statements about what it means to be a writer who has any oppositional character or intention, or any impatience with the reigning errors of the time. And one was, he said he knew when he was quite small that he had certain literary ability and what he called a power of facing unpleasant facts. I wanted to call my book on him A Power of Facing. The publishers, again, wouldn't hear of it. I'm always quarreling with publishers about this kind of thing. Because I thought it was nicely phrased. He could have said an ability to face or the power to face. A power of facing caught my attention. Unpleasant facts, he found that he could look them in the face. And he thought, well, if I can, why do other people let themselves off this elementary task? Maybe I could help them to do it. Yes, for me anyway, it's very enjoyable to find that I've noticed something, usually staring you in the face. Another thing that Orwell says is the hardest thing to see is what's right in front of your nose. And point it out to people and see the contortions they'll go through not to see a point.
We'll talk about that in a minute, because
especially the intellectuals.
Yeah, yeah, who are good at self-deception also.
They're either good at fooling others or themselves, or rather, if they're not good at it, they're very wedded to it.
There's in your other book, which is called Unacknowledged Legislation, Writers in the Public Sphere, you in the introduction, you talk about the purpose of the book and of a course you are teaching at the New School, and you say, how often when all parties in the state were agreed on a matter, it was individual pens which created the moral space for a true argument. So this relates to what you've just said about showing things that appear not to be there.
Yes, the name of the book that you just kindly mentioned is also the name of a course I teach. I mean, it comes from it in the New School in New York. And originally it was specifically about American writers and their contribution as public figures, as ethical figures. Because this country is a written country. It's based on documents. It's the only republic that is. It's composed. And therefore it's subject to rewrites and updates and revisions. It's a work in progress. And that can be inscribed on its history. For the one example I give is this. Thomas Paine and Benjamin Rush and a few other pamphleteers and polemicists did complain about slavery and proposed that it be banned in the Declaration of Independence, or failing that, by the Constitution. They lost. Between then and the rise of the anti-slavery movement of Benjamin Lloyd Garrison and others, there's a lapse of about 40 to 45 years. You can vary, but there's a whole amazing chunk of time when millions of slaves are born and die on American soil and nobody mentions it. It's because everyone's agreed. That argument's over. We had a quarrel about that. We settled it. We, as people would now say, we put that behind us and moved on. And at the time, the main imperatives are domestic consensus and also national security against outside threats. It's in no one's interest to bring it up. But then suddenly, a couple of writers decide, wait a minute, this is a subject we can't be leaving out. Garrison is one, a couple of obscure Quakers, and then, of course, Frederick Douglass, who's one of the great original American writers. But in between the parties and the vested interests in the society, there was a complete agreement. There's nothing worth talking about. So there's that. Then there's Mark Twain having a one-man, more or less one-man, pen campaign against American empire in 1898, the Spanish-American War. Very popular, agreed to by all parties. Twain satirizes it very bitterly, very brilliantly. A number of other such cases.
Let's talk a little about the relationship between truth and power, because a lot of of your writing is really shining a light on power, the statements of power, and so on. That's really a central struggle in your work, is it not?
Well, you put that rather flatteringly, I must say. I mean, it's not absent from what I say. No, I mean, I think power has to be ready to justify itself, has to be forced to do so at all times. We shouldn't ever make any assumption of anyone's right to rule, and we certainly mustn't let them make such an assumption. Mm-hmm. Sure. As for truth and power, someone who I've quarreled with quite often, Noam Chomsky, especially recently, makes the very good point that speaking truth to power may be too flabby a statement. Indeed, it must be pretty flabby because almost everyone uses it now in a rather approving way. Mm-hmm. That's always a bad sign, by the way, when everyone can say it. Mm-hmm. And he said, why do we think that power doesn't know the truth? Mm-hmm. Why not make the assumption that it does know the truth? It doesn't need to be told it just interprets, processes it differently. Mm-hmm. I think that's a perfectly good point. Mm-hmm. Truth spoken by power would be nice to see every now and then. Mm-hmm. Truth uttered by power would be good. In fact, that's partly what one tries to wring out of them, mm-hmm. is some admission or some clarity.
Now one of the areas that you have focused on in several small books are the icons of popular culture or of political power, and essentially pricking the balloon of illusion around them. Clinton being one. What is involved in that work program? I mean, does it flow naturally from all that you've said about yourself, a contrarian, a person who looks at things from the side? And what is it about our culture and our political system that creates these icons?
Well, can I leave the second question
yes.
to the last and go back? It has occurred to me, though I wasn't fully aware of this while I was doing it, that of the three main targets that I've had, or people have been nice enough to credit me with, mm-hmm. over the last, say, decade or so, Mother Teresa, the so-called Mother Teresa of Calcutta, the New Democrat, Mr. Clinton, and the supposed People's Princess, Diana Spencer, mm-hmm. all of which were quarrels between me and populism, because I think it's easy to say that you distrust the government, that you distrust the state. Again, that's something almost no one will take you up on. But if you say that you're very often pretty sure that it's the majority who's wrong, and the way that public opinion is constructed that's wrong, the way that popular mandates are construed that's wrong, then you can be accused of being an elitist or a snob and so on, and then you know you're onto something. Mm-hmm. So what I realized was that in doing these three things, I'd basically been settling an account with liberal illusions. Okay? Wake up any liberal, or don't even wake them up, just walk up and say, you're opposed, aren't you, to religious fundamentalism? Mm-hmm. Of course I am. One of the most okay things a liberal can say. Mm-hmm. Well, Mother Teresa of Calcutta was a fanatical fundamentalist. I mean, she took the most extreme line, a line far more extreme than her own church, on all matters of economics, of morality, of politics, of authority, and so on. Proselytizing among helpless people who were unable, trying to bribe them with handfuls of rice into converting. Praising the Duvalier family because it was stood up for the Catholic interest in Haiti. Fawning on Nancy Reagan, Charles Keating of the Lincoln Savings. All of this was right there for anyone to see. They wouldn't see it though, because no, she's a saint. She's doing work with the poor. It was, in fact, the poorest of the poor was the mantra. Mm-hmm. So they didn't want to hear that she was a fundamentalist. They thought she was on our side, so to speak. Same with the People's Princess, the ludicrous idea that a people's position can be passed on by hereditary succession. Mm-hmm. But they were sure she was, no, if you ask them, are you for monarchy and hereditary power? No. Is she a people's princess? Yes. Then the big white whale, Clinton. What about someone who is, war criminal, a taker of bribes from foreign dictatorships, almost certainly a rapist, plausibly accused anyway by 3 believable women of rape, executed a black man who was so mentally retarded that he was unable to plead or to understand the charges against him. Well, you're against all that, right, but you're for it when it's someone who you think is a New Democrat. Well, again, you know, I sometimes think all my birthdays have come at once, everyone's making it too easy for me. But all these targets were left alone and unguarded. So I thought, well, I'd be untrue to myself if I don't take at least a second look. But it was liberal illusions in all three cases. And most recently, because I wouldn't say that Noam Chomsky was an icon, and it would be rude to say that and untrue, and nor is it true that he's a guru. Certainly he doesn't want to be one or a cult leader, but he does have the status of something very like an intellectual leader and authority among a very large number of people, especially on campus. I did think it was necessary to have a fight with him about the insinuation, no, actually sometimes the assertion, that the inhabitants of the United States of America were morally equivalent to the membership of the Al-Qaeda organization. That was probably the bitterest of them all. And lost me the most friends.
But I guess the interesting question becomes, why do groups, whether in the case of Chomsky, the left, or in the case of liberals, Clinton and so on, what is the dynamic that puts these icons before us?
Oh, it's I'm sure what the answer to that is. It's the same vicarious impulse as makes people think, which is my main critique of religion, that they can cast their sins, say, onto a scapegoat figure who will then take their sins away. I mean, can you imagine a more repulsive idea? I cannot. Or a bigger abdication of what we call personal responsibility. It's a horrific idea, but it's pretty preached by our churches. Many people don't have time to follow, say, politics all the time, or as much as they should. They're aware that they don't, but they think, what I'll do is I'll find a candidate, I'll give him my vote, and then he can do the politics for me. I'm not going to do anything about the third world myself. I can't. It's too much. It's awful. I know I should do something, but I can't. But here's this woman in Calcutta who claims to be a saint. Well, I send her a quid or a dollar, or at least pretend that I thought she was doing it, because the rich world has a poor conscience. She can get on with doing that for me. And or Princess Diana perhaps would be the auxiliary. You know, she'll look after the crippled children and stuff. It's being vicarious. It's letting other people lead your life for you and make your decisions for you, and you're slightly relieved. You hope you've made the right call. It's a bit like celebrity culture, actually. It's taking people and judging not their reputation by their actions, but their actions by their reputations. So you're living a little through them. Well, I'm against the virtual life. I'm against the vicarious life. I think people should get a life of their own. So that's what I'm really arguing with them to do. And because of that, one can be accused of being a snob, a superior type, and so on. As I say, an accusation that increasingly delights me.
It sounds like you're saying that what you're witnessing there, or what is behind what you're witnessing, is an abdication of responsibility.
Certainly, it's a willing surrender, I'd rather say. It's almost a pleasurable, masochistic surrender. You know, we'll leave that to Bill, or Mother T, or whoever it might be. Sure, yeah, that's handing it off. Then we can go on with doing. I'm never sure exactly what they get. I mean, what are they doing with the rest of their lives, these people? I'm not sure. But I do know this, that if you point out to them that they've been fooled, they just gave their savings to someone who's a swamp real estate artist, they do not thank you for pointing it out. They're much more likely to blame you than the person who's just defrauded or deceived them. Why? Because they don't like to be told that they're gullible. People like to think that they're smart and wised up.
Is it? Do you surprise yourself in the fact that a British lefty has wound up in the United States writing about American politics?
No, not at all. I mean, I think the United States is fantastically hospitable in the first place. In the second place, it's very hospitable to writers. And in the third place, this may be a privilege that is just pure luck on my part. It's very hospitable to English people. And because the big secret of the United States is class and empire, okay, everyone knows there is a class system in an empire, but it's not officially admitted that there is. Whereas in England, those are the subjects that we're brought up inhaling with the milk of our mamas. We know something about it, and we can intuit it. It's part of our instinct as well as our education. Actually, it does give you a slight edge in arguments about the United States. I think that's the key myself, rather than any literary ability, which is often what Americans believe. They think that the British are more elegant and ironic than they are. It's not true at all. The British are very crude and very unironic, a very literal mind for the most part. But I don't want everyone to find out, by the way, that I don't want this trade secret.
I see.
Long may the illusion.
Because
long may the illusion that British people have sort of a clearer hold on the Oxford English Dictionary persist.
I see. But also, I thought you were saying you didn't want to give the trade secrets away. That this is a field where there's a lot of work to be done.
I'll just have to hope this channel is only watched by the elite, I think.
Which is very possible, or even less.
Fine.
You said recently that in an interview that I saw, you're a socialist living in a time when capitalism is more revolutionary.
Yes.
Talk a little about that and actually, what it tells us about your politics.
Can I just add to my last point? Thomas Paine, the greatest Englishman of his time, and perhaps all time, was also the greatest American of his time. And his pamphlets probably first used the term United States of America. So it may be for that reason, too, that English lefties feel at home here. And to my point, then, about what my own politics are, I remember writing that, or something like it. I may possibly have said, a Marxist living in a time where only capitalism appears to have revolutionary potential. Because it's easier to say that I still think like a Marxist politically, because I do. It's the way I was trained, and I think the materialist conception of history hasn't been bettered as an explanation of the way things happen. But the prescriptive bit, what should happen, or what's going to happen, seems to me to have dissolved, rather. So that to say that one is a socialist is more like expressing an attitude than really a politics. And there came a time, actually, when I was writing the letters to a young contrarian, when I thought, look, this is for the young, and it actually is written to students of mine. I don't address it, but I always have them in mind, individuals, when I'm writing. Well, you mustn't try and fool anybody if you're going to do that. You mustn't lie to the young. And if you've concluded that there is no longer an international socialist movement, that it's not going to revive, you're really only being a poseur if you say that you're a socialist nonetheless. And that's the position I'm in now. But I miss it. I miss it like an amputated limb. I miss the fact, I miss the way that there used to be an international left, and I'm very distressed and appalled at what's rushed in to fill the vacuum of the critique of liberal capitalism, because what's come in to fill that gap is much more something like theocratic primitivism, if not worse, fascism, that is now the alternative to the globalized capitalist structure. So that's an even greater reproach, if you like. But one must look the facts in the face.
How do you account for the failure of the left to deal with the events of 9/11? Does it relate to this?
Well, yes, I think, I suppose I'll accept your question in the form in which you put it. I don't think all the left failed at this point at all.
Right, yeah, the parts.
But there was a tremendous failure involving a large element of the left to think of it as something new, even, or to think of it as something dangerous. And yes, I think it honestly was, many people said, well, at least it's anti-globalization. Now that should have warned people of how callow and facile their critique was. They said, well, if this could be a part of it, maybe there's something wrong with your critique, man, because never mind what the Taliban and Al-Qaeda forces want to do to you, why don't you just take a look at what they've done to the societies they can influence? Societies where
Afghanistan.
the concept of time and the future and the past is as far as possible abolished. First task of a totalitarian regime. Everything that isn't forbidden is compulsory. Everything that isn't compulsory is forbidden. The abjection of women, or another, and of the sexual instinct, another unfailing sign of the totalitarian impulse. The destruction of all art and culture and music. And the very rapid immiseration of everyone, so that the hope, I suppose, would be they would be so poor and so ignorant that they wouldn't even know that that they were living in a bad situation. Probably, however, there had been enough education. Well, certainly, I don't see enough education, enough culture, enough experience for people to be able to survive it. But that's no thanks to the people who tried to impose it. So I personally find when there's a confrontation between everything I love, scientific inquiry, reason, cosmopolitanism, secularism, emancipation of women, so on. And those are the things I love, by the way, and everything I hate, Stone Age fascism, religious bullshit, and so on. I find it's a no-brainer. I know exactly which side I'm on. I knew right away. I felt exhilarated on the 11th of September. So I feel slightly ashamed to say that, in view of the fact that so many people lost their lives that day. But when the day was over and I'd been through the gamut of rage and disgust and nausea and so on, not fear, I will claim for myself. I'm not afraid of people like that. I'm very angered by them, but there was something I hadn't analyzed. When I went into it in myself, I was pleased to find it was exuberant. I thought, okay, right, I'll never get bored with fighting against these people. And their defeat will be absolute, it will be complete.
And it is because that event dispelled the illusions about what the adversary was up to? Yeah.
Yes. In part, and because it made people value, or had the potential for making people value things like science, reason, secularism. I would prefer to say myself atheism, but no, let's say secularism. The Enlightenment, things that people take for granted. Rather as when my friend Salman Rushdie was threatened with murder for money, for bounty, by a theocratic leader on the 14th of February 1989, I thought, well, okay, this is easy to decide. But a lot of people then were saying, but what about Muslim sensitivities? I mean, may he not have offended some people? And I said, just listen to what you're saying. Just can you have any idea what you sound like when you say that? We had to put up with a fair bit of this time too. And then I've also felt that we owed the people of Afghanistan a debt. I mean, we had let these Taliban characters take over their lives in their country because they were the clients of our filthy Pakistani military clients. I thought, well, here at last one can point out to people, we have to cancel this appalling debt and remove this foul regime. And I'm only sorry it didn't lead to the collapse of the Pakistani one.
You write, in talking about our present times, you say the next phase or epoch is already discernible. It is the fight to extend the concept of universal human rights and to match the globalization of production by the globalization of a common standard for justice and ethics. Does this help us understand why a piece of your enormous output is devoted to looking at human rights violations, the hypocrisy of those in power with regard to those issues?
If you say so, I would take it as a compliment.
Yeah.
I mean, to stay rather with globalization for a moment. It seems to me obvious, and it's been obvious for a long time, that whether you call it globalization or not, the world has increasingly become one economy. We all live in the same economy. Some of us a bit more than others, but it is interdependent and recognizable as such. Well, does that mean we all live in the same society? Shouldn't it mean that? No, it doesn't. Oddly enough, it doesn't quite mean that. Some of us have different kinds of societies within this, which are better off than the others, and have more claim on human rights and justice. So I think if we're going to have it, we're always being told of the benefits of it one way, we should be allowed to claim on our own behalf and that of others the counterpart. I mean, that's therefore what politics is to me. It isn't therefore anti-globalizing. It's cutting with the grain and saying this should be properly shared and administered. And then there's the exciting thought, because of universal jurisdiction, which is a concept that's come into common use in international law now, and the abolition of sovereign immunity as a defense for crimes against humanity, that even the largest and most powerful and wealthy state of them all, and the one that now most insists that there's a common standard for human rights and international law, would say, well, we would agree to apply these standards to ourselves. An elementary point, but one that needs to be fought over.
And is that what is involved in a project like your book on Kissinger that called The Trial of Henry Kissinger?
My campaign to get Kissinger brought within the orbit of law is something I'm very proud of, not because I think it was morally or ethically right, but because I think it was somewhat prescient. When I decided if I wrote a book that was called something like Why Henry Kissinger is a Scumbag Who's Done Some Filthy Things, for one thing, I'd still be writing it. And it would be a shelf long. That would never end. It would have to be updated every time the Library of Congress or the State Department declassifies a new document, by the way. There's another chapter of horror each time that happens. So no, let's go with what we know and say, why not let's apply to this the standards that have been established in the Pinochet and Milosevic hearings, and see if they do, basically. I may have made the odd false analogy here and there, and I've had some very intelligent critiques from lawyers about how I might have refined the point, but generally, yes, it fits. And it involves also the most colossal question. Are human rights campaigns and human rights hearings and human rights tribunals and procedures to be applied only to losers and or to small countries or small political leaderships? Is it just a means of cleaning up the nastier element of the small fry, or is it really supposed to apply to the whole of humanity? And in the case of Henry Kissinger, I could dramatize it like this. Never before has anyone this senior in the government of a country on the winning side of a series of wars have been asked to account for his behavior and for the things he ordered and authorized and covered up. Though these are so far only tentative lawsuits, mainly requiring information, they have within them the potential of... They force the question on the United States and its citizens, do we expect to abide by the standards we impose on others? Well, there couldn't be a more important question than that. There is another motive, of course, which is I simply think that the mere continued existence of this man in this culture and the way he's fawned on by my profession, the press, and another profession of which I'm a part-time member, the academy, and another profession with which I'm concerned, the publishing industry, all of whom have colluded in his lies, his fraudulence, his falsified publications. That's something that, on aesthetic grounds alone, makes one determined to put it right.
It sounds to me like in your work you're obviously a journalist, but only part journalist. I mean, the journalist who goes out and does the digging and finds the evidence, for example, in the Kissinger book, gathers the information that is coming out and so on. But on the other hand, somebody who's really very theoretical, who sees a big picture and relates that research to it. I mean, this is an obvious point on the one hand, but on the other hand, many of your colleagues don't do that in the American press.
Well, you keep putting me in this false position of asking questions which allow me to answer by saying, well, how right you are to say that there should already be a statue to me in Lafayette Square. And I mean, I find it so difficult. You're pushing an open door, I warn you.
Okay.
It's more like this. Look, as to the digging, I mean, I acknowledge in my Kissinger book, most of the spade work on the Kissinger stuff was done by other people, or is bought at the sacrifice of other people's lives. In other words, we know of certain terrible atrocities which Kissinger committed. So, I mean, I'm simply assembling raw material which was very dearly bought. And yeah, it's true, I didn't when I thought to myself, now would it be nice to do an investigation into the crimes of a recent Secretary of State? I wonder which one. I'm sure if I dug into the life of Cyrus Vance, I'd uncover all kinds of... I didn't need a roadmap to decide which one it was going to be. No, I mean, one is not flying completely blind. And so there's that. By the way, according to the sort of the Chomskyan worldview, I would have done just as well to investigate Cyrus Vance, because it's all the same. It's the system, not any one individual. I don't quite obviously believe that. Individuals do count and make a difference, and so do individual characters. But yeah, the reductio ad absurdum would be, why didn't I do Madeleine Albright or Cyrus Vance? I've discovered equally bad things. Not so. This is a truly spectacular case of an international rolling crime wave associated with one man. But I would far rather be recognized or discussed for what I'd written in the same year about Oscar Wilde, or Anthony Poe, or Patrick O'Brien, or Arthur Conan Doyle, because this is what I really do most of the time, and it's much harder. It involves much more reading and much more thinking. But politics, is someone no one can abstain from, but it shouldn't be much more than 25% of anyone's life, I don't think.
And let's talk about this other part of your writing, which we really haven't addressed, and that is really a scholarly effort to understand some of the great writers of our time. Is that kind of work different, and in what ways is it different from writing about public issues?
Well, it's true. In my main collection of work on that kind of topic, I do say that the public sphere of these things is always important, and someone who's got no knowledge of or interested in politics would be slightly, not necessarily blind in one eye, but perhaps a little near or long-sighted. It's necessary to have that. So if you're reviewing, say, Patrick O'Brien's wonderful sequence of novels about the Napoleonic War at sea, if you don't know something about what was going on then and what the struggle was between the French Revolution and Napoleonic successions to it and the British Empire, the novels would be that much less interesting. Indeed, I begin the argument there by saying that actually the Napoleonic Wars should be called the First World War. That was the first global war there ever was. But with someone like Anthony Poe, for example, who's written this extraordinary novel sequence about English life, social life in the upper class, in the sort of Proustian classes in London in the 20th century. Again, if you don't know some social history, you'll be to that extent disabled. But it would be quite possible to read it, I think, for pleasure alone, just as what it reveals about human nature and human motivation. He's comparable, I think, to George Eliot in that way of having some guess about what makes people behave the way they do and knowing what life is like.
If students were to watch this tape, this partial rendering of your intellectual journey, is there one lesson that you think they might draw from your journey that stands out?
Well, the only ones I would think would be interested in hearing from me would be those who have writing in mind as a career. I would expect, and I do draw students sometimes to my class in New York for that reason. And yes, I do have advice that may sound incredibly tautological, but isn't. You should first ask yourself if you really have to write. In other words, not is it something you'd like to do or have heard could be rewarding or enjoyable, or you think might. Has it ever occurred to you that you have no choice but to write? There's always someone, when I say this in a room full of students, who looks at me suddenly as if, how did you know that? That's how I do know. And if that's true, then it's fine. It will work. You will get it done. You may not be a howling success at it, but at least you will know you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And that's a pleasure lots of people don't have. And conversely, if you don't feel that, you might want to try something else. Because I doubt you'd be able to survive the disappointments that are inevitable. So it may sound to those who are immune that all of that's too easy to say, but actually it took me a long time to work it out, and I found that it works as advice to those who need it.
I also get the sense, one final point here, that you really engagement with the world is very important for you as a writer, and your willingness to follow your thoughts where they lead, and actually to change your thinking about particular issues. Is that fair?
Again, it's rather, if I may say so, it's rather generously phrased. But look, yes, if I come up against a pile of evidence that makes it seem as if my first assumption was untrue, I would rather change the assumption than try and change the evidence. Yes.
That's good. Yeah.
It's
maybe that's why you've never gone into government.
And so that's. But I do know that it may seem obvious when I say it and flattering when you say it. I do know that for a lot of people, that isn't easy. They would rather continue battering themselves against the pile of the evidence. They really would, even if they wear themselves out. And as for going out and having a look for myself, well, I think it's essential. As part of being an internationalist is wanting to see how other people and societies are, and how they look and feel. And I think some of the happiest moments of my life, as well as some of the most miserable ones, have been trying to do that, from North Korea to the Congo, which are the two places that have depressed me most and made me see how miserable human life can be made to be by other people, not by just the misfortunes of our nature or nature, Mother Nature. To the wonderful pleasure of going back, as I have, to countries that I first knew when they were dictatorships or colonies, and friends of mine were in jail or in exile, and going back and finding them out of jail and sometimes in power, though always aware that they might themselves one day repeat the mistakes. Still, being able to have seen that happen a few times has been, I think, the highest of the pleasures that go with this kind of life.
Christopher, on that note, I want to thank you, and I hope I'll get you to come back in November when you're back on the campus, and at that time I'll have a set of more hostile questions.
I can't wait.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.